Hello and welcome to this special look at the Victorian election campaign on ABC News. I'm Patricia Carvallis. It's great to have your company. In just 8 days, Victorians will decide whether Premier Daniel Andrews is given a third term in office or whether the coalition takes control. It will be the first time Victorians will have their say on how the government managed the pandemic in a state that endured one of the world's longest lockdowns. It will also be the first time people cast their vote in Australia since the Liberals were kicked out at the federal election in May. We'll hear from election analyst Anthony Green shortly, and later we'll talk to a panel of polling experts. But first, Melbourne's booming outer suburbs could be where this election is won or lost. Life in these growth corridors isn't always as rosy as the sales brochures make out, and a lack of services is compounding isolation and disadvantage. Margaret Paul and Roseanne Maloney have this special report.
Mornings in Melbourne's outer north are slow going, but the growth of this area has been very fast.
5 years ago, the population of Calcalo was about 100 people. Now, it's more than 6,000.
At this estate, there's only one road in and out. Rami Najmuddin moved to Calcalo to provide a bigger home for his family, but the price he pays is measured in time.
It takes a good 20-25 minutes just to get out onto the highway.
His wife Atira leaves home at 8:15 for the school drop-off.
It's going to take me about 45 minutes to just drop her to school.
On a bad day, cars are banked up so far all you can do is wait and wait and wait. Another reason people in this area spend so much time in the car is there's not much public transport. That's why 70% of the homes in Calcalo have 2 or more cars registered, compared to the state average of 55% of homes.
The infrastructure deficits are huge. That legacy of promise and undelivered promise, dotted lines on maps for new infrastructure, new rail infrastructure and the like, really right now is hitting its limit.
In parts of the outer suburbs, some communities are taking matters into their own hands.
I'm on my way to Diwali celebrations at a Sikh temple in Melbourne's outer west.
There's no bus stop near the temple in Plumpton, so volunteers are filling the gap. Manjit Singh has helped to organise these celebrations. He says running their own private bus service is the only way to bring this whole community together.
It is difficult because we don't have a bus service at all, but it would be nice if you could have something like a flexi bus that's been running in South Melton.
This is that flexi ride service, and I just booked a ride on it through an app.
Every week it takes about 700 people to designated destinations. Similar on-demand bus routes are funded by the state government to operate in a handful of outer suburbs, but experts say it's not enough.
The answer is to have a regular 20-minute bus service so people can just go to a bus stop and know that a bus will come very soon.
Here, in Melbourne's outer north, one developer didn't want to wait for the government to act, so the company started its own private service for residents.
It was about trying to open up the possibilities in terms of the destinations they could get to.
The key solution is for state government to plan and deliver public transport options as people move into new suburbs. We just can't have people and families moving in and waiting 10 years for the first bus.
While current polling suggests the Andrews government is on track for re-election, the chances of Labor losing its majority are now growing. Minor parties and independents are challenging both major parties in a complicated patchwork of races across Melbourne and the whole state. Here's the ABC's chief election analyst, Anthony Green, with a look at the electoral map.
For all the talk of candidates and policies and personalities at this election, really the story will be told by the political geography of Victoria. And you can see that when you look at the map of the state. Now, there's a big block of red seats over there in central Western Victoria. That is an area which was not Labor held until 1999. Labor's sweep through that area in 1999 put the Bracks government into office, and the coalition has struggled to win since. Labor previously only ever held 1 or 2 seats outside of Melbourne. Melbourne. So that block makes it harder for the Liberal Party to win. There's 2 or 3 seats they can win, but the election itself will probably be decided in Victoria. There's a few independents in the north which the Nationals and the Liberals might win back. If you look at Melbourne, the story here is either side of the Yarra River. North and west of the Yarra, everything's held by Labor. A couple of green seats in the inner city is the one difference. You've got seats like Melton in the far west, Werribee and Point Cook down in Wyndham. They're seats which the Labor is under threat from independents as well as the Liberal Party. But of all those 28 seats in Western and Northern Melbourne, they're the only 3 seats at real risk at this election, and it could be independents that gain them. For the Liberal Party, this part of Melbourne is normally all blue. Labor had a big win last time, so they gained a couple of seats, like who could forget Hawthorn being lost the last time, John Pasuto on our panel losing his seat. The Liberal Party can gain 4 or 5 seats in this part of Melbourne, but then the real story will be down on the outer southeast of Melbourne. We've got a new seat here, Pakenham, notionally Labor, but has no sitting member. There's other seats like Narrawarra North, Frankston, Carrum, Cranbourne. They're all on margins of 9 and 10%, so they're not the sort of seats you'd expect to fall without a big swing, but the swings may be very variable at this election because of how COVID unfolded and where tradesmen and small businessmen lived, and there's a lot of them down in southeast Melbourne. And finally, what to watch for is central Melbourne, because the Liberal Party are directing preferences to the Greens ahead of Labor for the first time since 2006 at a state election. So it's a big change there, and that puts a number of Labor seats at risk. Northcote, Richmond and Albert Park could all be won by the Greens. So if you combine 3 losses to the Greens, 3 to independents maybe, and a couple of gains for the Liberal Party, the Andrews government would be close to losing its majority. So the question is, will the Andrews government be returned, hold enough seats and be in majority, or is it going to be forced into minority?
Well, that's the big question. Will it be forced into minority? I'm joined now in the studio by Cos Samaras, who is the Director of Strategy and Campaigns of independent polling and research company Redbridge. Also Tony Barry, who's also at Redbridge. Thanks to both of you. And I'm going to start with you, Cos. What are the issues now dominating the campaign? We are literally just over a week out.
Well, in terms of the issues that are dominating the public mindset, it's cost of living. All the research that we do, everyone's feedback to us is they are overwhelmed by the stresses when it comes to the hip pocket. The only problem is they don't feel they're hearing much from the 2 political leaders at the moment.
It's interesting you say that. Tony, let's look at some of the breakdowns if we can. I know that you've got gender breakdowns in terms of demographics. What is it showing? Where are they leading?
Well, in terms of cost of living, we're seeing a definite gender split between male and female. I think 30% of men say cost of living is their number one issue, 43% of women. So we're seeing some really big movements, but it is across the board, across all demographics, millennial, Gen X and boomers.
Okay. Now, you say cost of living is a big issue, Cos, but the parties have been offering cost of living relief. We started the campaign launches at the beginning of the week, $250 offered by Labor, essentially a gas reserve policy for gas and cheaper gas from the Liberals. Are these policies resonating with people?
They would resonate if I think the 2 major political parties had made those announcements months out. So we're dealing with a very fragmented media market. And it's pretty clear to us that most voters out there are not hearing much from the campaign at all. And really, the only thing they are picking up is some of the negative stories around IBAC investigations and so on. That's all they're listening to at the moment, and they feel like the major parties are not talking to them. It's a marketing problem.
Tony, because the policies are pretty... there was a very cheap transport policy announced, for instance, by the Liberal Party, $2, and you get basically unlimited travel for the day. It's pretty cheap, and it seems to me quite potentially an alluring policy. Is it cutting through, though?
The problem is that, and it's all very counterintuitive, because at a time of high anxiety and stress about cost of living, and I've never seen any issues so pervasive in market research as cost of living is right now. But despite their anxieties, you'd think they'd be more in tune with the campaign because it's never been more important. I mean, I know it's a cliche that, this election is very important, but it is to their future. But they're incredibly disengaged. So it's quite counterintuitive. So they're not really hearing much at all, because I think there's no sort of story underpinning these announcements. They're just kind of unconnected value statements. They're not value statements. They're just unconnected announcements.
Okay, so the biggest dominating issues, and we're going to discuss it with our next panel, are integrity issues. Today, the Liberal Party essentially asking for an investigation. They're not happy with the Victorian Electoral Commission that's referred a matter to IBAC. Like, let's just park what the story is about and look at this at the way it's playing out politically. Both sides of politics, cause have integrity issues, but do voters notice, and who are they blaming?
They do notice, and they only pick up, as I've mentioned before, the one overwhelming narrative, and that is that both major parties are embroiled in some form of scandal, some form of alleged corruption, and not focused on their needs. So it is going to, in our opinion, drive voter sentiment away from them, and we will see a far more significant number of Victorians vote for minor parties and the Greens and the like at the upcoming election.
Okay, third party vote. It's going to be big at this election. What does that mean? Are we really realistically looking at a hung parliament here?
Well, it'll be lumpy, so it's going to fall in different places, the primary vote of both majors. But at the last election, it was 22% was the minor and independent vote combined. This election, we think it could be 25 plus. So
which is pretty big.
It's massive, yeah. When you think back to the 90s, the combined major party vote was over 90%. So the rest of the minors, independents, Democrats were fighting over about 8 or 9%. And so their preferences weren't as critical as they are now. This election, we're going to have 25, maybe even 30% where are up for grabs, their preferences. So preference strategies is incredibly important. And I can see the situation where Liberals normally, if they hit 45 primary, they'll win the seat. I can see in this election 46 or 47 might not get you there.
It's really fascinating. All right, the Teal Independents, they made a huge splash at the federal election in May. Are we going to see that replicated in Victoria, and who's the most in trouble? Is it Liberals?
The answer is yes, it's Liberals, and I think it will be limited in Victoria, just like it was in the federal election. So we have to keep in mind that the Teal Independent movement was far more successful in Sydney. So they picked up 4 federal seats up in that state. In Victoria, it's basically Goldstein and Hugh Yong. And I think what we're going to see at this state election is some success, possibly in seats of Kew, Hawthorn, to a lesser extent Caulfield, and independents being elected in seats like Benambra as well.
And the big question, the pandemic. It's been such a dominant theme in Victoria, particularly because of the rolling and long lockdowns. This year has been a different year, a reopening year. I don't hear the pandemic talked about much in this election campaign, Tony. Is it sort of like, don't talk about the war? What's going on?
Yeah, it's over. It's done. People want to move on. It's like trauma. They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
They don't need to be reminded of it. I think parties have to be very careful to tread on that ground because they've just moved and they want to move on.
That's really interesting. So do they want to punish the Premier, Dan Andrews?
I think there's a mixed reaction within the electorate. They're carrying their trauma, and I think all Victorians could probably tell a story to each other around what that experience was. It's going to resonate politically in certain cohorts. So women in lower socioeconomic backgrounds, in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, are going to be a problem for the Labor Party because of the pandemic.
And these are in safe Labor seats, Heartland?
Mostly in safe Labor seats, but also in some marginals. And that's because they overwhelmingly soaked up much of the stress of the lockdown. So they had limited financial capacity to respond to what was going on. They were carers, they were teachers, they did a whole bunch of work in that family environment and have not fully recovered, nor have their children, may I say. So I think that's where we're going to see on the night some pretty significant swings against the government because of that personal experience. And I don't think that the government actually has done anything to help them recover from that.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. You both are back next week for the night before the election campaign, where we'll see where it's all at. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cos and Samaras and Tony Barry there. Well, both major parties have made big spending promises that target the outer suburbs. Reporter Margaret Paul has been in the seat of Melton to see how the campaign's been playing out there.
Melton is the definition of a growth corridor. It used to be a country town west of Melbourne. Now it's part of the ever-expanding suburbs. Right now it's home to about 200,000 people, but that's expected to more than double by 2050 when Melton will be the size of Canberra. Locals say that growth is already putting pressure on infrastructure like roads and health services. So how's that going to play out in the state election? Let's go chat to some voters. Do you know who this guy is?
Yes.
What do you think of him?
I don't like him very much.
Why is that?
Because of all the corona stuff.
Dan Andrew? That's right, yeah. And I'm just wondering if you know who this guy is? No. Just wondering if you know who this guy is?
He's a
Dan Andrews. Okay, and do you know who this guy is?
Is that his name there?
I'm not keen on Daniel Andrews.
Why is that?
Because of the COVID and all that type of thing.
I'm a Labor man, but not for Dan. I'll tell you that now. I don't like him. I couldn't trust him.
This premier this time, he not know how to listen to the people. He only listen what he want to dictate to the people. So
I don't have anything negative or against him. You know, I think he did the best for us during COVID.
What are the issues that will decide your vote?
Hospital, but then again, they've been promising that for a long time, so can you believe that?
Nothing at all has been done. I mean, we need a hospital before we need railway crossings removed.
I'm just too eager to know more about the new Melton Hospital.
The road that I used to, take my kid to school, it's really terrible. Where I live, it's not being looked after.
Have you decided who you're going to vote for?
Not at this point.
I'm still voting for Labor, but not for Dan.
So have you decided who you're going to vote for in the election?
Yeah.
Who?
Independents. Vote independents.
The best looking independent, because I think they're local and they've got more nous. They're genuine.
They're genuine. Bringing down the cost of power bills was a central theme at both the Labor and the Coalition's Victorian election campaign launches last weekend. But how are their actual campaigns playing out on the ground? Joining me now is Raph Epstein, the host of ABC Radio Melbourne's Drive Show, and Charnel Vella, a political reporter with Channel 7. Hello and welcome to both of you. All right, let's get stuck in. Charnel, starting with you first. I heard from the pollsters that cost of living is the number one issue. Everyone is obsessed with this.
Sure.
Are what the party's promising resonating, and who's getting the cut through?
I think the energy saver from Labor has had cut through because people have had experience with it. It was announced already pre-election and then they did a second hit. So they knew it was going to be popular because they had that information about how many people wanted to take it up. I've also heard a lot about free tampons and free, products in libraries. That's really resonated. Then the Liberal Party have also done some good announcement. Free lunches in schools has really resonated with parents. It was a smart announcement, and even the Labor Party admitted to me behind the scenes, they did a good job on that. So I think those are the ones that have cut through, is the one that makes a difference in people's lives.
And at the same time, the Liberals have been focusing on cost of living, $2 cheap, transport, which I think resonated a bit, didn't it, Raph? And then on energy, it seems like a gas reserve or ending the sort of moratorium on gas in Victoria. Is that really having any...
I'm not sure turbocharging gas helps your candidates in a seat like Hawthorn and Kew. In fact, I think that probably costs you a few votes there. I think Charnel's right. I've done a lot of what Margaret does. I've spoken to maybe 200 people, asking them what resonates. I've got a lot of respect for Cos and Tony. My strong feeling, though, and this is very much as a Victorian, we all lived through the lockdowns, I think if there's one thing that defines your vote, it actually is the pandemic and it is the lockdown. I'm not saying that's definitely a negative or a positive for anyone, but the number one thing I get, to be honest, when I speak to people, the thing they're literate about, the thing they're most passionate about, the thing they have a view of is the pandemic. Now, you might be either loving Dan Andrews or hating him. You might be furious at the Liberal Party because you say they undermined the health orders, or, yeah, they were right. But if there's one thing that people know about, and I think will actually shape their view, I'm not basing this on anything other than those conversations and the calls and the texts, I think it's the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the pandemic is a huge kind of underlying sleeper issue, right?
Absolutely.
We're not voting on it because we're hoping to get out of it, but we certainly experienced it acutely in Victoria.
And I think that's what's driven the early vote. I think people had made up their mind on the pandemic. You either liked the way it was handled or you didn't, and that's what's seeing those record numbers in early voting.
Sure. I mean, there has been a trend generally towards early voting, so I'm always a bit personally cautious about over-interpreting what it means for a vote.
They also know who Matthew Guy is. I mean, they don't know him as well as Dan Andrews. Obviously, you don't know anyone as well as someone who's that prominent during the pandemic.
Well, every day, standing up for hours, they know him.
Matthew Guy was there last time. And I do suspect people have a view. Again, I'm not saying it's a winning or a losing view, but I do think people have made up their minds about the two leaders to a large extent. And Cos and Tony are very right. There's no story stringing the policies together from either side. So I think...
Well, they're both spending quite a lot, even though there is a pretty significant budget issue in Victoria.
Certainly.
So it's not like the Liberals are kind of going fiscally, you know, tightening their belts.
No, they could have saved half the money of SRL and spent the other half. I think that would have done the same job, maybe even better, if they were talking about bringing us to a bigger surplus.
So is it then a referendum on Daniel Andrews?
I think that is the unknown in this election, and that's what makes this election so different to every other one. You can't measure if there is hatred for him or if people do really like him and they're happy with how it's handled. And that's the question mark about what people are going to do when they get into the booth.
Well, the thing is, he's a divisive figure, so you either love him or you hate him. The problem for Labor is where do those votes fall? How do you think they'll fall? In the outer suburbs, in Melton, in those areas, this is potentially a big problem for the Labor Party.
Yeah, we did a broadcasting pack in them. I've been to Point Cook twice, which is the sort of seat maybe an independent could pick up off Labor. It's very easy to find someone who will say they really don't like Dan Andrews. One thing Cos will point out, though, they might not like him. Do they think he's competent? I think that was the issue that Scott Morrison had. People didn't always love him. The issue for Scott Morrison was they thought he was no longer good at his job. Now, does anybody think Dan Andrews is ineffective or incompetent? I don't think they feel that. They might feel he has too much control and he's too competent. So I think the competency question complicates where those feelings go. But I do think it's a referendum on Dan Andrews. Yeah. The other reason is if you haven't had a bus or a school or a hospital near you for the last 8 years, like pandemic aside, Dan Andrews' personality aside, after 8 years, you'd be going, well, I haven't got what I wanted. Do I hold the people who've been there for 19 of the last 23 years responsible? So I think it's fair to say it most likely is more of a referendum on Dan Andrews and his performance. I don't think that's remarkable.
Well, I think we know that elections, the government of the day loses an election 100%. Rather than an opposition winning. So then it becomes an issue of, I think, these dominant integrity issues, which I tried to drill down with Cos and Tony with.
Yeah.
But now the Liberals are having all these integrity issues.
They are.
Today, the Victorian Electoral Commission, it's getting a bit ugly, are putting out a statement. What's going on here?
I think it was a bad move by the Liberal Party today to go so hard against the VEC. This story happened yesterday. It was losing some momentum today. Obviously, Matthew Guy was questioned at length about it, but it would have trailed off over the weekend. What they've done is thrown a match on a dry field by going after the VEC in this way. And if people are going to early vote, they're going to do it tomorrow. This has pushed it up to the top of the news agenda and kept it front of mind. And people look at this and they go, both parties have integrity issues. So I suspect they're driving people towards the independent vote and now people towards the Greens.
Yeah, because, you know, one of the things Matthew Guy, the opposition leader in Victoria, has been trying to do is say this government is full of integrity issues. But now he's got his own. So how can he run that line? How can it resonate?
I think it's a big mistake. I agree with Chanel. The worst moment Matthew Guy had this year was when this story first broke. And he didn't want to answer some of the questions. Caused him a lot of pain. What they've done, I think Chanel's right, they've extended that story. Now, Dan Andrews had some really uncomfortable moments 2 weeks ago, so 14 days ago up until about 70 days ago, with sort of these repeated questions, and the dominant story in the evening news bulletins, which is still important, was Dan Andrews isn't answering the integrity question. To pick a fight because the Victorian Electoral Commission have handed the investigation to the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, I don't understand that when I'd be lucky to find 1 in 100 people in the street who understand the difference between those two bodies. So it doesn't make sense to me that as the early vote rises, they're continuing that story.
I think that's right. I find it very politically strange to go into that territory.
But they feel deeply, deeply burned. They feel it's an issue of justice. They feel it's an issue of being wronged by the independent umpire. I don't think the feeling is not genuine. I just question the tactic.
OK, so if voters are now looking at both sides and thinking they all have integrity issues, let's go back to the third vote issue that you raised, because I think that's really interesting. Who's that likely to benefit? Are we now going into minority government territory for the Andrews government if that third-party vote becomes so significant that they can't win a majority?
I think it does become that issue as well for Labor, and I think that the Greens are looking at what's happened over the last couple of days and just rubbing their hands together. They know that with these issues playing out, that people are going, well, where else do I put my vote? And I think for areas like Northcote and Richmond, this drives that.
Raf, do you think the Greens are going to be sort of because out of the last federal election, I thought the Greens story was an undertold one during the campaign. Is this going to be a similar story in Victoria?
I wouldn't guess. The thing that's really interesting...
Week out.
The thing that I find very curious, there's no way Dan Andrews is a big draw card in a seat like Melton or Pakenham. It's the very opposite in the Green seats. There are huge Dan Andrews billboards in Richmond and in Albert Park. The Greens have had a lot of success. You presume they bring the techniques from the federal campaign to the state campaign. What's also very clear is that with the significant money limits, the independents haven't had as long a runway, and I think the quality of the independents is really showing... is the real indicator of whether or not they'll pick up a seat like Kew, Hawthorn or Caulfield. I think that they might not be as successful, but there's no doubt, like Cos and Tony are right, all the published polls say the same thing. The vote for the major parties is shrinking. Minority government is possible. I think Labor is still ahead with 8 days to go.
With 8 days to go, is that your view too?
Yeah, that is absolutely my view as well. I think they are still inching ahead. I don't think the Liberal Party bought themselves any favours today.
Well, that's really interesting.
If the Liberal Party had another 2 or 3 weeks, like this, I'm not saying they aren't taking pain off the government, they are. I'm not sure they've got a long enough runway.
So in the next week, final comments and brief, because we're nearly out of time, but what do you expect? What are we going to see in the next couple of days?
I don't think you'll see anything remarkable in the mainstream media. I think the thing to do is actually, I shouldn't say this because I run a radio station and you run it and you're doing a TV show. It'll be in your local electorate. Get on YouTube. Watch the ads. Log on to your newspaper that I hope you pay a subscription for, and look at the ads that you're getting, because that'll give you an indication. What are they using? Which ads are they targeting? That'll give you some idea of how they're feeling about their chances.
Yeah, Chanel, obviously the next week is going to be quite key for both of those leaders to kind of stick to their messages.
Yes. Raf was quite measured. I think this week could be wild. I just think that people are going to lose their minds, especially given what's happened today. And I just think people are going to they're going to scramble, and there's going to be last minute. I feel like there's going to be chaos. I really hope there's not.
I have a feeling that it's going to be a wild week too. We don't know, but we're going to be back next week. Thank you so much to both of you. You've been wonderful guests. Raf Epstein and Chanel Vella joining me there. Well, that's the program for tonight. We are bringing you this program again next Friday on the eve of the election to bring you everything you need to know about Victoria votes. I'm Patricia Carvelis. Have a great night.